I studied at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and now working here. And I guess in both spaces, I've had an international focus in terms of the things I've been studying in relation to gender and sports governance. And I've been interested in two main pieces: the governance of gender eligibility in women's sport and taking an STS perspective and feminist perspective for that, but then also the actions related to promoting women in leadership positions in international sport. So I guess it's the international piece that I'm bringing to the project.
Great, thank you all. So as I indicated, we're going to structure this session as a panel conversation, which I'll facilitate. But I briefly want to just provide a general overview of the project before we dive into questions. And we're thrilled to take questions along the way as well. So just an overview. So the project aims to understand why, despite visible gains in women's sport participation, gender inclusion efforts in Australian sport have yet to lend to gender parity in leadership roles or broad accessibility for a range of people who navigate different forms of marginalization in Australian society. And so by examining the governance landscape of gender inclusion in sport and how it's changed over time, we hope to deepen understandings of the historical, social, and political conditions that have influenced and as well as hindered progress in Australian sport. So we brought an interdisciplinary team together. You've heard the sociologists, the historical elements. I have a combination of socio-legal and anthropological training. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Overall, though, the current state of play in Australia suggests that the policy interventions that have been introduced to date at improving gender equality in sport are really producing inconsistent results, which is kind of the setup for the project. So it's been widely recognized by others that despite the surge in popularity of women's sport in recent years, few women occupy coaching and leadership roles. Female athletes receive substantially lower pay and have less job stability than their male counterparts. And that's not even addressing how these patterns intersect with forms of entrenched sexism, homophobia, racism, and ableism. Now, many state-funded interventions still also only encourage rather than mandate change, as is in the case of talent programs for women in coaching and leadership roles. Ethnic minority and Indigenous women still face barriers at grassroots and elite levels, and queer, intersex, and trans constituencies continue to experience marginalization and often overt discrimination, both within and beyond sport. So in exploring these tensions, we are looking to collect both historical and qualitative data to trace how gender inclusion has changed over time, drawing on both intersectional and regulatory theories to help develop some more robust explanations of these longer-term trends. And as we do, we hope to co-develop a series of research-informed responses that can help support gender inclusion efforts moving forward. That said, a distinguishing feature of the project, and Maddie's kind of alluded to it with the international component, is that we don't conceive of Australian sport as a bounded jurisdiction confined to state-sanctioned borders. Since we want to understand governance both across time and scale, we explicitly try to consider the transnational influences on how gender inclusion practices and rules take shape. So for example, if we reflect on the most recent trans participation debate, and of course I don't find that to be a debate at all, but it was certainly framed like that during the most recent federal election, it's hard not to address those narratives without situating them in wider global discourses and legislation that have promoted the exclusion of trans women and trans children from sport. And not just sport, we're seeing it with healthcare as well. And as such, conceptually, the project aligns with earlier feminist transnational scholarship, such as Inderpal Grewal's work on transnational America, which argues it's essential to examine national discourses and those national projects, both within and beyond the confines of the nation state. So what does that mean? In that vein, one of our aims is to develop what we're calling an ecologically informed mapping across different scales that capture grassroots, state and territorial, national and transnational dimensions of these shifts. And we'll get into it a little bit more with the panel discussion, and certainly welcome questions around this in Q&A. And our hope in doing this is that by bringing feminist insights together with regulatory scholars' use of what they term social ecological theories, that combination will allow us to open new venues for feminist inquiry, but also help us identify leverage points for systematic change. So in other words, we see this as an opportunity to scale up and adapt intersectional frameworks in ways that attend to all the political, the representational, and the structural considerations of these governance processes, which we hope will shed light on distinct barriers affecting non-white and non-cisgender women as well. So that's probably enough from me. You probably don't want to hear any more, but we're happy to delve into more of those details and nuts and bolts around the projects. I also want to let the Q&A really highlight that everyone on the team is bringing distinct skills and expertise for the project, so we'll be asking some questions around that as well. And of course, another key aim of this project is to really support more dialogues around these issues across Australia, and SAGE has really already been doing such a fantastic job of facilitating that, so we really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today. So, Q&A style, and this will be fun since we can all see each other online. I've just talked about what the project is about, but I think it might be fun to actually hear what the team's excited about with the project. And so, Fee, I might just kick off with you since you've made some jokes about how excited you are about this project. I won't say what the nature of those jokes, but apparently it's deeply rooted in your identity, which makes me happy to hear. But I'd love to hear what is exciting you about the project.
Kate, you've teased them now.
Sorry, I did that deliberately.
Okay, we had a team meeting last week and I inadvertently said that I think this ARC project may be my sexuality because every time I read it, I get pretty excited about it. And there's a few reasons for that, I guess, Kate, to be super cheesy to start off with, but obviously the team aspect. I've had the pleasure of working already with Maddie and Ruth on sort of smaller projects. I haven't had the pleasure of working with Kate yet, and so far it's been an absolute dream run. And I guess a lot of sort of people have said to me when you're putting in these grants and things that you want to be putting something in that you'd work on anyway without the money. And I think both in terms of the people and the project, for me, that just ticks both boxes. I would happily work on this forever without any resourcing. And so it's been so exciting to actually get some resourcing behind it. In terms of the project, though, I guess for me, I'm really excited that there's a historical dimension to this. And I say this with the caveat that I'm not exactly included necessarily in a historical discipline. So I'm a bit of a weirdo when it comes to history. So I'm just really, really excited that, that there's a question of time in this. And by that, I mean, not just the recording of events or history, but where time can function as the central question rather than just a method. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the people in the project, Kate, I'm excited about it all.
Oh, that's amazing. And Maddie?
Definitely want to echo Fee's comments about the team. Yeah, I suppose it's interesting. When I did my PhD in the US, it wasn't really a major part of the training there to think about doing team-based projects. Like, you really were sort of thinking about how to be a lone wolf in the discipline of sociology, and to have the opportunity then to be able to join a team project and one linked to an issue and topic that I care so much about, the development of gender equality in Australian sport, is again, like you said, a really dream opportunity for me. And related to that, what I'm excited about is being able to think, bring the lessons that I've learned and the thinking I've been doing around the governance of gender equality in sport at the international level, and really think carefully about that now in the context of Australia, and have the opportunity to make the connection to where I was growing up playing sport, and where I'm following the national politics around gender equity in sport. So yeah, the opportunity to make that link back to home is a really exciting piece for me of this project.
Great. And Ruth?
Thanks. Oh yeah. Again, obviously, the opportunity to work with an interdisciplinary team and such a dynamic team is incredibly exciting. I think for me as well, and Simone's actually alluded to it in the chat in terms of the timeliness of this, and particularly now with the change of government as well, I was excited about how important this is at this particular time within our sort of contemporary society. So post-COVID, and we're sort of seeing a bit more what that's going to look like. And I think the gaps that COVID has, really shone a light on in terms of gender equity in sport. We have seen this different momentum and a sort of rising profile, I think, of women's sport, particularly in Victoria, where I am. There's been a whole heap of initiatives over the last 5 years. So there's all these things going on, but I think it's a really important time to reflect critically on that. And I'm excited that this project will allow us to do that. As you alluded to earlier, Kate, as well, just the different levels that we've been able to look at with this project. I've very much been involved in the everyday practices of community sports clubs, being able to connect that to the higher levels and to sort of create those links between, right the way up to sort of international governance and regulatory frameworks, and how that filters down, and how things like the current sort of climate within Victoria are influencing at that very local level. I'm super excited about being able to sort of have the capacity to do a project of this scale, I guess, to be able to capture all those different nuances and put that critical lens on.
No, that's terrific. And I'll add just a brief aside that, I'm thrilled about all the things that you mentioned, but I have to say in this particular environment, for over 15 years, I've been kind of banging on about, sport is so important about how we think about regulation and governance in the world. And everyone, I'd say at this moment that I've spoken to in Australia since this project's been awarded has been like, oh my gosh, I can completely see it now, Kate. It's a microcosm of not just society, but it also shapes societal dynamics. And so I do think it's just a wonderful opportunity to engage in other fields and show the significance of sport and gender across different disciplines as well. So, we've talked about the broader shape of the project, but I'd love it if everyone could share a little bit more about what they're doing on the project. And Ruth, I might throw to you since you were just speaking kind of along those lines.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so as I've sort of been talking to, my involvement and kind of responsibilities on the project really pinned down to the local level and looking at what's happening on the local level. So the work I'll be responsible for on this project is answering the research question, what are the effects of recent regulatory measures and actions on Australian sports participants? And I'll be sort of looking at that, doing an in-depth exploration within the community sport context. So obviously the bedrock of where participation in sport happens in Australia, and doing sort of detailed qualitative analysis and qualitative data collection with club volunteers, with coaches, with players and participants, also looking at the local government level as well in that context, and trying to sort of work with clubs on understanding how particular policies and practices impact what they do within the club environment, how much sort of comes from the bottom up and what the clubs are looking to do themselves, which has certainly been a big feature in previous research I've done. And also sort of look at some of the recent advancements, so things like the work that the Office for Women in Sport and Recreation have been doing within Victoria, campaigns such as Vic Health's This Girl Can campaign. How's that filtered down to that local level, and what sort of things is it bringing about, what opportunities is it bringing for clubs, what kind of constraints? And within that there'll be interviews, but also we really want to again look at the everyday within the club. So there'll be elements of participant observation, spending in-depth and detailed time within the club environments as well. And particularly looking at those micro practices, issues around space, the organisation of space, and some visual methodologies within that as well to capture what's happening in the club environment. Where do women and girls feel included? Where do they feel excluded? And what are the sort of the dynamics influencing that?
Great. And Maddie, we might just go from grassroots to international and talk about Maddie's section.
Yeah, great. So if I follow Ruth's structure there, the key question that's going to relate to the work that I'm doing is, what are the key policy interventions supporting gender inclusion in Australian sport, and who are the key actors, including up to the level of international sports governing bodies that have informed them. And here I'm going to be involved in trying to discern the connections between the developments that have been happening, not necessarily only at a governance level, but at a feminist mobilization level. If we think about the sort of organisations at the international level that have been significant from the point of view of things like the Brighton Declaration and getting sport included in the Beijing conference from the 90s and so on, and the sort of the statements and commitments that feminists have mobilized to get from both sports governing bodies and large international governing bodies like the UN. How do those kinds of shifts at the international level come down to impact at the national and ultimately also even the community and local level in the Australian context? And for me, it's not a one-way direction there. It's also the Australian context feeding up and potentially shaping what's happening at the international level as well. So that's the dynamic that I'm going to be exploring and looking to better understand, what role has Australia played in these international developments around gender equity in sport. And I guess practically some of the things that I'll be doing will be archival work. So there's the Anita White Foundation archives in the UK, which are the key archives for International Working Group on Women in Sport and their related activities, as well as other women's sports groups that have been active over the past few decades. So, working through their materials to sort of identify which, where and how Australia has figured in their mobilisation. Also the Olympic archives here in Lausanne, and later this year attending the IWG conference in New Zealand to also there start to make face-to-face connections with people who've had a role to play in the Australian context.
Yeah, and that's great, Maddie. And in fact, your illustration of an explanation of what you've described actually captures why we're using social ecology as a framework, because it helps us get at those feedback loops across scales. Fee, I want to throw to you.
And now we'll go back in time across the different dimensions. So yeah, my main responsibility is this temporal dimension, as I mentioned before. In particular, we're looking to map the landscape of gender inclusion interventions. So particularly, obviously, we're focusing on the solutions that have been proposed rather than just reinventing the wheel with all that amazing scholarship that's looked at the barriers to inclusion. So we're mapping those gender inclusion interventions implemented at both state and national levels. Obviously, Maddie's going to take a little bit of the international on the historical part there. And particularly since 1984 and 1984, we've selected as a start point because of the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984, and it nicely kind of coincides with a 40-year anniversary of that act in 2024. So that's quite a long time period from my perspective, but an awesome one. There's a lot of activity within the kind of the 80s and the 90s that I'll be focusing a lot of my attention on. So the Women's Sport and Media Report of 1985, the development of the Women's Sport Promotion Unit in 1987, and the subsequent National Policy and Plan, the Towards Equity for Women in Sport seminar of 1991, and the publications that came out of that in 91 and 92 as well as things that have happened since then, including in 2006, there was a Senate report called About Time, and I find this one quite interesting for the linguistic aspects of it. around the temporal dimension. But when that was launched, the then Prime Minister Bob Hawke stated that I'll read the quote, so it's kind of nice. So sport is vital to the well-being and development of Australian society. Sorry, I've completely butchered that. The times. I told you I'm not a very good historian because I've stuffed up the dates there. Sorry, this was the 1992 report. That was then followed by the 2006 About Time one. Anyway, I'll continue the quote. It is about time that Australians and the Australian media realises that women's sport is no way inferior to men's. And it's just this kind of the circular discourse that we've seen. These reports get released, or plans and initiatives get released. Politicians are backing them. In terms of those press releases that accompany them, there's usually this kind of sense that it's about time that something changed. And we've seen that even right up until the Victorian inquiry in 2015 in the Office for Women in Sport that Ruth mentioned as well. So I'm really, really interested in looking at the textual analysis around all of these policies, plans, procedures, strategic documents and press releases, and really trying to get to analyse those to contribute to the framework.
Yeah, great. And in the interest of time, I might just summarise my contribution to the project briefly, because I know Adele also has a question she'd like to ask. My role is really to help support in terms of carrying out the national and state interviews within Australia, and then also help us synthesize what is going to be obviously a huge range of data so that we can kind of do that iteratively to build new theory and to translate it to different audiences. But Adele, you said you had a question, and I want to make sure you have space to do it if it flows well still.
It's interrupting the flow a little bit now, but I can still ask it because I was, I really like that the international aspect is being included. So Maddie, my question was for the whole team, but particularly for you, about the role that Australia's played in all this. I think that's a really interesting question. And I wonder whether there's been anything that you've noticed already or so far that, that kind of sparked that question, that you thought this is a question we need to explore, because I can see that this may have, something that happened in Australia has influenced international policy or practice.
That's a really great question, Adele. If I'm truly honest, I haven't actually got a core insight from something I've even seen in my previous archival work, for example, to suggest that there was a clear role so my archival work previously was looking at the emergence of commitments to leadership, women in leadership by the International Olympic Committee, and how that timeline unfolded. And the key women who stepped up, at least, and the other key actors as well who stepped up weren't necessarily Australian. But there was an IWG conference held in Sydney to correspond also with the Olympic Games. So this is sort of getting a little bit later in the timeline. But I imagine, though, that some of the events that Fiona has mentioned, for example, some of the statements and gatherings that have been held in the lead up to Sydney are going to be, I expect there would be synergies with things like the IWG conference coming to Australia at around that time. So it's an open empirical question, actually, for me. What has been the role and the connections? I'm not even really across the in-depth history of an organisation like IWG, and not only IWG. I know that there are multiple women's sports organisations operating at that international level, but how has Australia contributed to the work of those organisations? It's an open empirical question.
Yeah, that's really good, because it just made me think, I know a lot of our Australian feminists have been so influential in academia and feminist theorising. So yeah, that will be, really great I'm sure you'll find something, and then that will be so good for us to incorporate and to be able to talk about. So thanks.
Yeah, Adele, that's a great question. Actually, it dovetails to the next set of questions I was going to ask the team to reflect on, because we're very explicit in the project description about shared feminist sentiments, and the nature of the project being a feminist project, and one that is also incorporating elements, I hope holistically, in terms of intersectionality. I guess I'd like to ask everyone to reflect on, how do you see those commitments reflecting the project itself and your role in the project? Again, I've talked about intersectionality, and I'll talk about it a little bit more when I get to my point about it, but I'd love to hear what others say. And maybe we'll throw, Maddie, since you just spoke, maybe you can just kind of carry on with what you were discussing first.
Sorry, I was just typing a little note to everyone and to Adele in relation to her last comment there. Yeah, this is so certainly at the when I've thought about what I've seen at the international level, I've really learned, and this is especially from, I guess, it's not only from the things I've studied around the regulation of eligibility in women's sport. It's also about what I've seen at the women in leadership level, that at least at the regulation of eligibility level, absolutely the way that we're thinking about these politics has to begin from the perspective of athletes who are being most impacted and targeted and stigmatized by these regulations, where the sort of the violence that occurs through these kinds of regulatory interventions is so often pushed underground by things like appeals to science and objectivity and so on and so forth. And it's been really important for me to learn how to bring the intersectional violence that's involved in eligibility regulation to the surface. But in the case of women in leadership, and this topic of women in leadership in international sport, there's a real blind spot. There's a real dominance of that narrative at the international level by women from certain countries, and also certain women within countries. It has been a very sort of often white woman's narrative, the narrative of how women are advancing in leadership positions in the case of international sports governance. So I feel a real, I guess, that's for me, there's a real commitment here to trying to make sure that we're not telling the story of white Australian feminists and white Australian women when we're doing this project, including in terms of, and also, sort of just revealing the politics, the intersectional politics that are at stake when, for example, representatives of Australia are engaging in international level policy making and gender equality and sport politics as well.
No, definitely. Ruth?
Thanks. And just to build on the points that Maddie's made and to take that very much down to the local level, I think that's how I sort of see particularly what I'll be focusing on the project playing out. And just having that opportunity to undertake a deeper intersectional analysis of community sport and gender within community sport, which hasn't always happened in the past, and I think definitely sort of gets glossed over or it doesn't really do that true intersectional work of seeing the multiple dimensions. And if we think about policies that are trying to sort of govern gender inclusion and support gender inclusion, and generally they don't engage in an intersectional understanding of how that's done. So I'm really wanting to sort of engage with this project in that way of saying, well, okay, how can we get policies to respond to gender thinking intersectionally as well, but also how does that play out at the local level? It's a hard concept to grasp and to engage with as researchers, but how does that impact the everyday practices of club volunteers, and how can they respond to that in thinking about how they engage with gender in the club environment, as well as looking very much at the experiences of many, you know, different types of women and girls within that club environment, and then allowing their experiences to come through. So that's sort of really how I think the possibilities of intersectionality in this particular context.
Great. And Fee?
Yeah, I guess for me, obviously reiterate everything that Maddie and Ruth have mentioned as well, but particularly from the historical aspect. So it's not that intersectionality in terms of the concept might be kind of new in the discourse, but it's not that those things weren't tried or attempted in the previous policies and strategies. So I'm even thinking in terms of historical work as well. So Marion Stell's great book that was published in 1991 referred to the double bind of Aboriginal women. The minority women were mentioned in the 1985 report that I briefly mentioned there, and groups with special needs were mentioned also in 2006 in the About time. So it's more about, well, what's happened in terms of the limitations of this language, how the language might have shifted, but also some of the constraints that haven't led to those broader outcomes that we would have expected on the basis of what's in the reports.
Yeah, that's great. And I think all of your responses have kind of reflected the kind of situated feminist approach we're trying to bring to the methodology of the project, but also, and maybe this is too much information, but you know, one of the other dimensions that I think is really important of making sure it's an intersectional analysis where we're partnering with organizations that are actually navigating these things on the ground. You know, it's somewhat instrumentalist for me because I really have struggled with this as an athlete and a coach in Australia, coming from the United States, that the grammar and the lack of grammar around racialized and sexual inequalities that underpin sport, Australian sport and governance, that grammar does not exist in the way that I've, you know, been able to discuss things with others and open up those problems in other parts of the world. And so we're really trying to open that up for broader discussions and invite more people into the project to do that kind of work with us, because it's been, you know, I know every sport culture is different, but it is something that's been quite striking. And so part of the partners on the project are helping us do that kind of grassroots work to understand what they've done in terms of advocacy as well. I'm mindful of time, so I might just do a quick rapid round response from us so we can open up for more questions, because I see the chat is blowing up in amazing ways. Just a rapid round set of responses, and I'll just go ping, ping, ping. As I just wanted to ask everyone, you know, what do you hope that we accomplish through the project? And Ruth, I might start with you.
Thanks, Kay. I think I really hope that we can start to, through the framework that we want to develop, map sort of tangible ways for sports to enact better gender equity policy, and to really be able to translate that down to that grassroots level. I think that's sort of what's been missing in a lot of the work done to date.
Great. Maddie?
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I'm really excited about the I guess, again, maybe building on what Ruth has said too, the how we're going to translate our findings to policy and practical audience, and the fact that we've built into the project, you know, events and opportunities to with funding to be able to meaningfully bring together people from the sports sector and discuss the project with them throughout the project and not only at the end. That for me is really exciting, and where I hope we can have some creative and new impacts.
Great. And Fee?
Yeah, I think obviously that the production of knowledge and the practical outcomes super important, but also for me in terms of the feminist sensibility in terms of outcomes. I think, you know, I'm from VU, we're not a group of 8 uni, we don't get a lot of discovery grants, and so for me being really responsible with the resources that I've been privileged enough to receive through this project to kind of build and continue to build some of the stuff that we've been doing with our postgraduate researchers at VU and kind of facilitate that enabling and supportive environment through any opportunities that arise through being able to pay people to help us on the projects. Really, really important thing, and particularly thinking about the equitable outcomes in terms of resourcing. So it's more a project management kind of outcome, but I think it's super important as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, Fee, because I've been speaking to a lot of my students, many of whom are queer, trans, and women of color, and talking through those dimensions of how we can model a project while still appealing to the ARC has been kind of a sub-project of ways that we can share of doing that kind of work. And I'm sure others have done it very well, but I think you're right, it's really, really important. And I guess the only other thing I would add is that, you know, as someone who's an ethnographer, I really see this as a project of studying up. So we're really trying to shed light on power and domination, how it operates in sport, to help find holes where we can leverage and you know, acknowledge policy blind spots with some, you know, productive suggestions on how to change them. But I'm also hoping that we can, you know, really foster more communities of practice across feminist camps to think through how we can, you know, build a community, help each other get more funding in the door, help our partners in advocacy and civil society to also do work. So maybe that's a little too ambitious for an ARC project, but you've got to start somewhere. And again, there's already things bubbling up in Australia. So I think it's a great time to be joining forces with others in this space. So thanks everyone for listening to kind of the Q&A, and I hope it gave you a sense of the project. We're delighted to take questions or feedback as well. So we might open it up.
Kate, would you like to have a look at the question any questions in the chat?
Great, yep. Oh, sorry. So Simone asked a great question early on that I've totally missed and had to scroll back up for. So Simone, do you want me to read it, Simone, or would you like to come on and chat with us?
I'll come on and chat. Sure. I love our sessions where we can actually all get together and talk about these things. Yeah, just thinking about the different kind of speeds, if you like, of policy agendas and what's been rolled out. And those of you living in Victoria and New South Wales have been very fortunate to be engaged in that, both in terms of policies that fund sports and innovations happening, but also research being funded through those agendas. Whereas in Queensland, we've seen very little. Actually, we've seen the disbanding of the Women and Girls Committee on Sport and Recreation in the last few years. So we are seeing many different things happening. So I'm interested in, particularly as we're talking about the 2006 Senate report, where I remember writing a submission to, and then we had a change of government. So that was a Liberal government where that policy was in. And then we had the Rudd government come in 2007, and we didn't actually see necessarily a policy agenda emerge out of that. So I'm really interested in how you're thinking about that, the political context, our federated system, and yeah, I'll just throw it open to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Bea, do you want to take a stab at the historical? Because I can talk about some of the contemporary things.
I guess other than saying yes, the political will absolutely inform some of that important textual analysis. And yeah, I don't have much more to add on that apart from yes, but I'd also be cautious about as well saying just because we've got a flurry of activity, as we've noticed throughout that time in these particular spaces at this time, that would necessarily last. So, you know, the disbanding of things that have happened in Queensland could just as easily fall over in Victoria and New South Wales, I think, based on the history. Okay, I'll throw to you.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say there's some really interesting things that have been going on in just the early interviews and discussions around the galvanizing around Queensland becoming the hub of sport, and how the women's sport initiative is going to be a central pillar of that supposedly, but in speaking to some of the actors on the ground, they're quite suspicious about how it's being instrumentalized. So we might actually see some really progressive looking policies coming out, or practices at least, in Queensland coming up in coming years. But speaking to some actors on the ground, they're quite concerned that it's actually not listening to more grassroots concerns, that it's galvanizing certain elements of high performance, you know, essentializing women's bodies by, menstrual tracking as our solution for high performance moving forward. So it's interesting that people are already identifying selective and essentialized elements to put forth in women's sport as an answer around certain practices, rather than those deeper discussions that others have raised. So I'm actually quite curious what will happen, but in just preliminary interviews, we have some very, very savvy civil society actors and policymakers trying to think through ways to go through the back door. So we may not see it on paper, but I think we might see some really innovative practices behind the scenes. And we're hoping to capture that in the project. Ruth, Maddie, did you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, Simone, when you were talking about the, I'm asking myself, I wonder what role the Olympics are gonna play. And I know the role of the IOC is starting to shift, like in terms of how they're building their contracts with host cities, but I think it'll be too late for Brisbane. So if, like, for example, they're gonna put concrete, much more concrete gender objectives into their contracts with host cities. But that will be for future host cities post 2032. So, but then it makes me think also, about, if we think back to Sydney, what was the legacy there? And especially since these Olympic Games they do have a national legacy, but they also have a very specific city and state legacy, I think. And so, yeah, I don't have an answer, but I'm thinking about like how we can start to think about the different, it's true that we have sort of different ecosystems at the state level. So how to sort of explain how where these are coming from and what these mean for gender equity initiatives is, I think, really interesting and important.
Yeah, and Maddie, how interesting is that becomes an opportunity as the credibility of the IOC and mega events are under threat? I mean, it's actually a really interesting set of dimensions that we're trying to capture in the project, actually, about how things that don't seem to be related to gender equity actually might create opportunities. So that's a great example. One other question in the chat was about the usefulness and purpose of the social ecological model. And I guess, I probably should have had at least one slide prepared on this. And so I'll maybe just briefly try to map it out in really concrete terms. So we are using social ecology as a way to map the scales movement, both quote unquote up to the international and down to the grassroots. And I really hate using that directional mode because, as you can see from some of the examples, grassroots can inform international in ways that are unexpected. So it doesn't necessarily move up, it doesn't necessarily move down, but they can actually be entangled in really interesting ways. And the Olympics in Brisbane will give us an opportunity to look at that, I think, if not in this project, then for future researchers. And so we really liked the ecological model because it would let us capture time and space across those scales, but it also gave us a little bit more structure. So Maddie and I both do a lot of work in STS, and I find entanglements to be really productive framework, but it doesn't give you some of the structure that fields or other kinds of things can give you some boundedness. And so we needed some boundedness, not because we wanted to force it on the project, but because we noticed as we were mapping out the project that the ecosystems that we're looking at actually do see themselves as bounded entities and not always crossing. So an ecological model let us capture some of those boundaries that they acknowledge while also moving across them. I hope that answers your question, Stephen. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add more to that.
It does. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, of course. Did anyone want to add to that?
I think you touched it well there, Kate, in terms of it is about allowing us to consider the layers. It offers that framework, but I think as well it's the intersection with the feminist analysis as well, sort of what social ecology traditionally doesn't allow us to sort of really get into the depth of power relations within those different ecologies. So it's the combination of the two, I think we've sort of conceived as being the most productive here, to look at all those multiple areas and bring that together.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And Stephen, thank you for asking that question, because we did, when we were writing this out in an ARC project, we were kind of bashing our heads like, how much do you go into it and how much don't you go into it? And how is it going to adapt over the project? So that'll be also fun to find out.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a model I'm using in some work I'm doing at the moment on sports concussion, and I found it really useful because it allows you to look at those interactions as being layered, but then also interconnected. And it's confirming to see scholars of your stature using this effectively as well.
Oh, that's really interesting to hear, because I'm just finishing a book on traumatic brain injury and I didn't use that approach. So I'd love to hear what you end up capturing that perhaps this book that I'm finishing up doesn't capture. So maybe we can chat more later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions or comments?
Can I ask a follow-up question on that topic? I'm really interested in how you bring your STS thinking into social ecology, and also thinking about power and the notion of policy actors and what policy does, and how you're thinking about that in a kind of more than human sense.
Who wants to take that stab? Maddie, do you want to go first? I've been speaking a lot.
I think it's a really good question. I suppose the way that we're conceptualizing like the sort of field relations here is certainly for me something that resonates with my work that I've done with Kate as well, but with what I have learned and taken from STS. But I think there's also, and this is not actually in how we've written the application, but I think there will be a dynamics of expertise and a politics of expertise that will be interesting for us to examine in the context of this project. I mean, the expertise of gender equity policy and so on is a thing, and is something that that scholars are interested in and have been studying. Especially, I mean, I've seen it mostly at the international level. So the gender experts that work with the UN and so on and so forth. But I think the way that these policy statements and commitments and strategies and so on are being developed in Australia, and in concert with things happening at the local level and in concert with things happening at the international level, will certainly, I imagine, be creating new forms of expertise around gender equality, giving new people the opportunity to sort of claim expertise in relation to gender equity in sport. And so it will be interesting, I think, to see how those dynamics evolve over the time period that we're looking at, and across the scales too.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing that I'd add is just thinking back through my first large scale project on sport regulation, which was around the regulation of fair play, and how that was both while it's about doping, it's also about a whole range of other things, and the colonial legacies of that, and how women have always been a separate category within those discussions. And it was always, the two were always entangled from the origins of the discussions of fair play. It was never doping one agenda, gender verification another. But I'm thinking back to the archival work and how those objects speak back to us, and how policymakers in interviews talked about the frameworks that they were navigating, and really actually giving them significant agency as actors that both confined and enabled them to do certain things. And so I think even our relationships to policy in this space will be recognized as really powerful actors. And even in micro levels, like in some of the archives, some of the things that were really powerful were the administrative assistant writing a note to get something captured that hadn't been officially documented in a meeting, but needed to be in there. And then someone taking that note that was scrawled on 10 years later in a meeting to say, hey, we've actually discussed this. So I think, seeing what Fee and Maddie find in the archives, I think will be really interesting as well. Ruth and Fee,
I'll just add one little thing to that, and I think, Simone, you kind of already kind of said it before when you said you yourself submitted to the 2006 About Time, and I'm really fascinated by the 1991 seminar, the list of names in there in terms of attendees, but also presenters. Like they're recognizable even to me, however many years on. And I'm really fascinated about following some of those threads, and particularly about how there's those advocates' sense of what has happened in the last 30 or so years. Academics as well as people within the field.
We have a couple more minutes. I don't know if anyone had other thoughts.
Just a quick question. You mentioned how the research assistants are as much part of the team, and just wondering if they've come on board yet. And yeah, do we get to meet them soon? Or
Oh, I would love to introduce them all. We're actually waiting for the funds to come through. Of course, administrative processes are actors as well in this. Ruth, I think you can go live about some of the people you've hired. Is that okay? Are we allowed to do that or no?
Yeah. So I'm hoping to work with one of my colleagues who's just finishing her PhD at the moment, Nadia Bevan, who's been sort of involved in different aspects of gender and sport, and specifically looking at body image at the moment and impact on physical activity with a gender lens. So yeah, hoping that she'll be able to come on board once she's completed her PhD with the project.
it's just so wonderful to have, you know, the ARC supporting a project and all the opportunities for capacity development and for, you know, for the team, but also the broader people that you're bringing in. So that's really exciting, because there's not enough opportunities for us to pay people to, you know, advance their work and collaborate.
Yeah, and Adele, one thing that we're actually planning is a workshop at TASA later on in the project to bring a group of people, particularly ECRs. We're hoping to have some extra funding to support ECRs or HDR students who can't get there, around how do you think through questions of gender inclusion in your project, sport and non-sport related. So we're hoping to kind of leverage other kinds of activities with some additional funds to really build out some thoughts and some other kinds of capacity building workshops. I mean, we'll probably end up learning just as much from them as well, so I shouldn't call it a capacity building workshop, but we are hoping to build some of those elements in the projects, even though the funding pot did get cut a bit, but we are preserving that in the project as well.
Great. I think there's a question from Suzanne, and then we might wrap up.
Yeah, so Suzanne, I don't know if you want to share it or I can read it. I'm happy to read it. Oh, Maddie's answering. Maddie, do you want to just share it verbally?
Yeah, sure. So Susan asked about the archive on women's sport in the UK, and it's the Anita White Foundation, University of Chichester, is it, in the south of the UK. And it's not only IWG. I think there's also Women's Sport International that also have their a lot of materials there. And I think they've really tried to sort of build this as an archive for the sort of gender equality and sport diplomacy and the women's sports groups that have been particularly active since the 90s, but which predate the 90s for sure.
Thank you so much. It's 3 o'clock, and I know we're all very busy and have our time schedules, but I really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us. And I'm really excited about the potential of the project and, you know, what you're going to be able to do. It's just really great that it's being funded at this time in particular. Thank you to everyone who took time out of their days to come along and join us and ask questions and listen. And keep an eye out for our next SAGE seminar. I will promote it on Twitter and all those outlets. And yeah, if anybody's interested in giving a seminar and you want a platform, please do get in touch as well, and we can have a chat. So we're always happy to try and, you know, have panels and different things like that. So thanks.
And thanks so much for having us today. Sorry, Simone, did I cut you off? Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Another great seminar. And also just to mention on the top of what Adele said, that we're really keen to try and engage and promote more research by Indigenous women and scholars around Indigenous women's experience of sport and also gender diversity. So we're always having rolling kind of topics, so we're really keen to keep that kind of free flowing. So we're also going to do some more on disability sport, because Griffith has now set up the Griffith Inclusive Futures, so we're going to be doing some more work in that space as well. So yeah, great way to connect, and thank you everyone for your time, and we look forward to following this exciting project as it unfolds.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.